Hello and a good afternoon from New York City. My name is Bart van Ark and I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and welcome to our monthly panel discussion called Window On. And for this month of April, our window will be on a continent, and it will be the continent of Latin America. So welcome, thank you for joining us. Latin America has lived up to its reputation recently of being a world or a region of opportunities and disappointments all at once. Some of the economies have suffered big economic challenges and political challenges, but others have been doing actually very well. And when we look at the outlook for the region as a whole, at least for the near future, it looks pretty okay, but we also know that in Latin America things can change very quickly due to domestic circumstances in individual countries or global challenges in the world around us. So it's very important for us as Conference Board to help our members to think about what are the opportunities and the risks in Latin America's region. So we follow this very closely as part of our global economic outlook, but we have to benefit this time from some recent releases that we have been doing. Among others, a release on productivity performance around the world, including Latin America. Last week, we also released our survey of global consumer confidence, which includes most of Latin American economies. So this is really a good occasion to take a closer look at what is going on in the region and what is ahead of us. And today I'm really benefiting from a very good panel that can take us through some of this work. And before I introduce you to the panel, what we will be discussing today is a broad range of issues. We'll start with a segment that is looking at the comparative performance, both from an economic and a business point of view in Latin America's economies. What are the growth dynamics across the region, what is happening to growth, but also what is happening to employment and job opportunities, what is happening to productivity. And then we'll spend a segment on a key issue of importance for Latin America, frankly for any region, but certainly in Latin America, and that is the role of demand, the sentiment of consumers and how they think about spending, but also how this is related to the huge concerns that we're still having around inequality in the region. Even though inequality has come down in the past decade or so, it's still comparatively high compared to the rest of the world. And then finally, we'll spend a segment that is more focusing on policy and strategy issues. And we'll talk about issues around human capital and around the role of digitization in economic growth. We'll talk about Latin America's engagement in global value chains and also the regional integration in the region. So a lot to discuss, and as I said, I'm really benefiting from a fantastic panel. They're all remote. That's what you get with a topic like this. They're in different places. And I'd like to welcome my panel here. First of all, Jill Hedges, who is Deputy Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica, has worked on a lot of issues around Latin America, particularly on the Southern Cone and Venezuela, and has been a frequent contributor to Oxford Analytica's Daily Brief. Jill, it's great to have you on.
Thanks very much. Very nice to be with you.
Then I'd like to introduce Roberta Jacobson, Ambassador Roberta Jacobson. She's a senior advisor at Albright Stonewright Group, and she draws really on more than 30 years of diplomatic experience around the region. Until May 2018, she served as U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, where she oversaw the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship and managed a broad array of issues, including trade and investment, security and immigration, environment and human rights, about everything that we will have to address. Roberta, it's fantastic that you could free up some time out of your busy schedule. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Bart.
And then we go to Sao Paulo and welcome Lia Valls Pereira. She is currently the coordinator of foreign trade statistics at the Brazilian Institute of Economics at the Coutinho Vargas Foundation. She's also a deputy professor at the Faculty of Economic Sciences at State University of Rio de Janeiro. Actually, I said Sao Paulo, but she's in Rio, I believe. And her areas of research are foreign trade, which we'll talk about, international economic relations, commercial agreements and regulations. Lia, it's great to have you on.
Okay, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I am in Rio de Janeiro. I am from
Rio de Janeiro. I apologize for putting you in Sao Paulo.
Yes.
They're both great places. Right.
São Paulo.
And then finally we go to Buenos Aires, where we have Martin Ibanez Frocham. Martin is a senior partner at Mercer, advising clients in Latin America on issues around executive talent. He's a business leader of career for Latin America at Mercer, general director of operations of Mercer in Mexico, and General Manager of Mercer in Argentina. So a lot of experience you bring to the table today, Martin. Great to have you on.
Thank you, Bart, for the invitation.
Great. So fantastic panel. Before we go into the meet right away, let me just make sure that you can participate in this webcast in multiple ways. Most importantly is that you can ask questions, and please do so. Ask questions anytime during this webcast. Put it into the chat box that is in your screen. You can put in your questions there. I will weave them in during the conversation. We have a couple of places where we can address those questions. We have a few slides to present, so you can download those slides and share it in your own organization. Sometimes it might be easier to look at the slides full screen. You can do that by clicking the 4 arrows at the top right of your screen, and then of course if you click on it again, you'll get back to the regular layout. There's a brief evaluation at the end of the webcast. We always like to hear from you, so please do so. And then finally, some of you will be eligible for earning credits here. Today, these are CPE credits with NESBA. If you are, then please make sure that you type in your full name and email address in the space provided. Click OK for the free pop-ups that occur during the program. Stay online for the entire webcast. And of course, the credit is only available if you are participating live in the webcast. Okay, so we have handled all the introductions, everything to make this webcast a success. So let's go right away to ask our audience a question. We love to get these poll questions, so our team is going to put this up for you now. And our first poll question is to get your view on whether the recent modest growth recovery that we've been seeing in many Latin American countries might be the beginning of a stronger growth trajectory for the next 5 years compared to the past 5. So do you think that what we have been recently seeing is really the beginnings of a stronger growth performance? Do you strongly agree with that? Do you somewhat agree with that? Do you somewhat disagree, strongly disagree, or perhaps don't know? And we'll give you a couple of seconds to respond, and then I'll ask each of my panel members to quickly in 30 seconds respond to what is coming out from this. So we give it 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're closing it down. And the opinions are quite split. There's about 1/3 who is uncertain around this. There's 1/3 who somewhat agrees, 1/3 who somewhat disagrees. So it's a little bit of a mixed picture here. Nobody is really 100% confident that this is good or bad. So very quickly, all 3 of you, Leah, perhaps you first, 30 seconds. Are you surprised about this outcome? Where would you put yourself?
No, not at all. I think we are living in a very uncertain scenario, at least from the perspective of Brazil.
Yeah.
In terms of the projection of growth, we are always put in doubt. And also, I think the global economic outlook has weakened. And so I'm not very optimistic about the growth in the next year or this year, especially for
Perfect.
Brazil.
Fine. Jill, your first reaction to these results. People are very iffy about their assessment of the situation.
I think I'm also very iffy about my assessment of the situation, and I agree with Leah. I think the global environment is very uncertain at the moment. It's not very favorable to Latin America. There's a real question over commodity prices, and a lot of the region is still very commodity dependent. And I think, as we're probably going to be talking more about later on, given the problems with productivity and with exchange rate volatility, it's a very mixed picture, but I would be very hesitant to predict really strong growth over the next 5 years.
Roberta, are you on the same page, or can you bring a bit more optimism to the table?
I'm not sure I can, Bart. Thank you. I think I agree with all of the respondents. I'm probably split in my own mind in thirds, but more I lean towards disagreeing in a sense. I don't see anything in growth forecasts, in particular in Brazil and Mexico, where they keep being revised downward, that suggests that at least the larger economies will return to much stronger growth soon. The exceptions are some of the Pacific Alliance countries, perhaps Peru, Colombia, Chile, but the diversity of the region makes it extremely difficult to be general about this overall. But I think I agree with Jill in terms of both commodity prices and the region as a whole not likely to pull out quickly.
Martin, you engage with businesses in the region every day. Any more optimism that you hear from them?
Actually not. I mean, the answer are more optimistic than my perception when I interact with my clients across the ocean. If we look at Latin America, South America overall, I mean, the economies and my clients are mostly linked to the commodities and the outlook for commodity prices for the next few years are modest. So there is not a lot of confidence there that the economy will make a significant turn. And then Mexico, which also my experience is very different from South America because it's mostly linked to the U.S. economy. I mean, the most significant driver of the growth is manufacturing in Mexico, and therefore there is a lot of uncertainty. Although the U.S. economy is doing well or very well, but there is also a lot of uncertainty whether all the trade conflicts that may arise between the U.S. and Mexico.
Right. Okay, so well, let's see if we can bring up the optimism a little bit during the webcast, but I would agree with all of your assessments that it is a concerning situation. And actually, when we quickly look through some of the data here, we won't spend too much time on it. You can download those slides if you wish. With thanks to Oxford Analytica, here's an interesting slide that is indeed looking at how differently countries are performing. This is looking at the performance of GDP per capita over the past 4 or 5 years. And you can see that some countries have been doing okay, including Uruguay or Chile, for example, among some of the bigger countries. But then there are countries that really have slowed down very significantly. Some of the troubled countries like Argentina and Venezuela we'll talk about a little more. But it's a highly diverse picture that we are looking at here. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to benefit from the recent work that we published on the latest numbers on productivity. One way to think about it is to basically look at the growth of an economy like being consisting out of two parts. One is the growth of productivity, the other one is the growth of employment. These two things add up to the growth of the economy, growth of GDP. And you can see in this slide for 7 of the largest countries that the blue part, which is the growth of employment, versus the orange part, which is the growth of productivity, we see that overall growth of the economy has slowed down. Quite often this is the result of weakening in employment, but in quite a few cases also a significant weakening in productivity growth. So you see the orange part becoming smaller in many countries, and the blue part, the employment part, is a bit of a mixed picture. All countries slowed. Mexico has picked up a little bit, but again a lot of that's a result of employment growth. You can see the blue bar going up a lot, but the orange bar, part of the bar, staying relatively small. If you take the region as a whole, you see a similar picture. Now we're looking at year over year, but we also can look at the next 2 years, 2019 and 2020, which you see at the end of this chart. And you see, yes, there's some optimism in terms of, output growth, GDP growth that can go up a little bit, but most of it will be driven by employment growth, which is good. Creating jobs is a great thing, but at the same time, we see very weak or even negative productivity growth. And that is a concern because it means that we may be creating a lot of jobs that are not really very productive. And then the question is whether that recovery is sustainable. So let me turn here to the panel. And Jill, I'd like to start with you. You're an expert in many areas, but particularly also on South America, Southern Cone. And when you look at some of these countries, I want to go back to the previous slide for a second, but let me also know if there are other slides you'd like to address. Some ups and downs. Where at the moment among these larger countries do you see the best prospects for a recovery, and why is that the case?
Well, I have to admit that I focus mainly on Argentina, which is probably about the weakest case. In terms of the other larger economies, Chile and Peru are probably better placed. They've had reasonably steady growth. They both face the problem that they're very dependent on commodities. However much they've looked outward and tried to increase their exports, they're very much commodity focused, especially copper. And I think that's a particularly serious problem in Peru, just because there are also a lot of regional conflicts over mining projects, which have held quite a lot of them up. So it's very much a mixed picture. In Peru, you've also got the ongoing impact of the Odebrecht scandal. We've had 5 former presidents involved, including Alan Garcia, who committed suicide last week. I think it's roiling what's already a complicated political situation. And I think we need to bear in mind that in Latin America, politics always has a very large impact on the economy, probably much more so than in North America or Western Europe. As I say, I think Argentina would be my main sort of weak case, simply because we've got elections later in this year which are driving uncertainty even further. The economy is continuing to contract. The foreign debt is continuing to go up again. Inflation is running at about 55% annual. And there's huge uncertainty both over what the outcome of the elections will be and what any incoming government, whether it's the incumbent or an opposition party, can actually achieve in terms of turning this round. And your country risk has gone up by 50 basis points just today. It's over 900 basis points now for the first time since Mauricio Macri took office. So I think there are very, very real concerns there about, not only are we not going to see very strong growth, but we could be heading towards another fairly serious crisis, which would also have knock-on effects for other places in the region.
Thank you. So let's move to Brazil. Leah, I mean, Brazil in this chart, of course, we've seen a big crisis over the past few years. Brazil is beginning to come out of this crisis gradually. There's a new administration in place. My question is, has it fundamentally altered anything already? Do we see something changing? What is the most likely source of growth that you see ahead of you? Will it be employment growth? Will it be productivity? Will it be investment in the economy? So how much of this recovery from that deep crisis is taking hold right now?
I think this is still a big question here in Brazil. The question of productivity is in the top agenda of people that is worried about the rate of growth in Brazil. We have some kind of barriers. So even when we do reform, like we did in the 90s, the trade reform, the firms that have low productivity continue to exist. People that are unemployed, they go to the informal sector. So we have a large proportion of firms in Brazil that have very low productivity and still remains. It's like that we have some kind of an environment that protects the more inefficiency instead of protecting the more efficiency. The new government has announced a lot of reforms, but we're really in the beginning, okay? And the main focus has been the reform of Social Security, because of the huge fiscal problem in Brazil. Only yesterday, the first step to begin to evaluate the reform that will need a change in our constitution has begun. So I think we have a long path already in this government to deliver something, some results. People are putting a lot of hope in the Social Security reform, and I think it's very, very, very important sign, okay? In the other side, for in the trade reform, they are saying about making a new step of liberalization. It has announced, but really anything has been implemented until now. So the focus really in Brazil nowadays is the Social Security as a first step to show that we can make some reforms, and it's put as a very important thing in order to give confidence to the investment and to the business. Every time you have some problem with this kind of reform, in the Congress, the business confidence goes down. When they think that we are going to really proceed with the Social Security reform, the business confidence goes out. So I think it's the main issue nowadays in Brazil, and we still have to do a lot of things to improve the productivity and the legal reforms, tax reforms, a lot of reforms to have a more efficient environment in the case of Brazil.
So Leah, one quick question is the Social Security reform, just in 30 seconds, we don't have a lot of time, but for those people not familiar with the reform that we're talking about, can you briefly explain?
Yes, in very simple terms, in Brazil, we have the people that go retired, if they are public servants, they got their full salary, their full wages, and continue all their life, okay? People can go to retirement with 45, 50 years. So it's completely impossible to sustain this kind of Social Security in Brazil. So it's not that we are going to Chile, but the idea that we have make some reform that at least make Brazil more closer to the other social securities that are in other countries. Okay, Brazil has a very a system that really privileges a lot of few people and is very expensive. Expensive. We don't have anymore. Our demographic bonus is still over. Okay, so it's a very huge problem for the Brazilian.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. That's very helpful. Just before I go to Roberta, there was a quick question about how to read this chart that's on your screen. So really, this is the growth of GDP, and the growth of GDP is made up out of two factors. One is the growth of employment, and the other one is the growth of the productivity of the jobs. So employment growth plus productivity growth equals the growth of GDP. But those are growth numbers. And taking that to Mexico, Roberta, on the one hand, there's good news because Mexico has seen an improvement in GDP growth. A lot of that is coming from employment growth, and that's good. But then the productivity has been very weak. There's been a lot going on in Mexico. We have a new government. It's not quite clear exactly what they will stand for or what they will really do. Then there is this whole issue of the trade negotiations with the United States, and it sounds like this is sort of still stuck for ratification. On the other side, there's a lot of interest from other emerging markets to actually use Mexico more as a gateway towards the United States. So there's a mixed bag of news here for Mexico. Where do you think things stand with the country?
Well, I think in some ways you've given the answer in your question. It's a very mixed bag. Growth in the past few years has been considered relatively solid because it's positive, as you say. But Mexican leaders have constantly emphasized the importance of getting to somewhere around 4% growth, and they've not realized that in any recent years. Growth has hovered around 2%. This year, growth is predicted to be around 1%, but I'll be honest with you, I would not be at all surprised if we actually saw growth be pretty close to zero this year. On the USMCA or the NAFTA renegotiation, obviously all three countries have yet to ratify it. The fact of the matter is, in the terms of Mexico and Canada, while there's extremely strong political support for ratification at this point, neither country can politically afford to ratify the USMCA while the steel and aluminum tariffs are still in effect. And until those come off, which doesn't look imminent, I do not see ratification taking place in those two other countries, in particular because Canada has elections this fall. But if we were hoping for ratification from those two countries to help pressure the United States for ratification, not only won't we see that, but the conventional wisdom, which I agree with, is that we are unlikely to see that trade deal ratified by the United States, frankly, until after the 2020 presidential elections, which is really a long way off. And so I don't necessarily see that as helping the economic situation overall. Similarly, we've seen the beginning of still fairly localized, but I think significant labor difficulties in Mexico, which to some extent I think are very much linked to President López Obrador, or AMLO. There are lots of groups who believe that under AMLO there will be greater tolerance for labor disputes or unrest. So far those have been largely along the US-Mexico border, but there have been rumblings of others, including Walmart, a huge employer, that could consider, and did not in that case, but who could consider labor actions. It is incredibly unclear what AMLO's economic policy will really be. Rhetorically, it is anti-business very strongly, but in practical terms, he hasn't necessarily carried out all of those suggestions. In terms of emerging markets using Mexico for access to the United States, I think there's still a great deal of interest in that, just as Mexican governments have over the last couple of years stressed the diversification of their own trading situation instead of such high concentration in the United States and North America. The truth of the matter is Mexico will not be able to ever really replace its relationship with the United States, and I don't see yet You see some emerging markets that are using Mexico, whether it's Hyundai for manufacturing or others, but I don't see a groundswell of that yet. And I do think that the argument can be made that, in fact, the U.S. administration unfortunately squandered what could have been possible via the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, by moving out of that immediately upon taking office, which probably would have helped address some of the issues Mexico is facing, and frankly is very little different than the USMCA, although clearly far broader and addresses to some extent the China issue. So that is a lost opportunity.
What do you believe is more important for Mexico right now? Is to get their domestic economy in order, or their relationships with the United States and the rest of the world in terms of their growth outlook?
Well, my own view would be that in getting their own house in order, which I do think is a huge priority for them, that has to include the trade relationship with the United States, because I don't see them truly improving their situation economically unless it is via greater integration in North America. So I think the two are almost linked in that respect. But I think that's been harder to do, frankly, under the current U.S. administration. And I think right now we don't see a López Obrador administration that is really doing everything it needs to get its own house in order. It's clearly focusing on macroeconomic stability still, and that's good. It has talked about the importance of maintaining the fiscal discipline that it's had over the last number of years. It's almost become a religion. And yet the promises made by López Obrador on the economic and infrastructure side sound like budget busters if he pursues them with the involvement of the state, which seems to be his preference.
Martin, we talked extensively about the three big ones, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. When you look at it just from a level of the region as a whole, it's hard to think about the region as a whole, but there are other countries there that are important too. What would you add to the discussion so far?
I mean, one of the most important challenges that my clients face across Latin America on productivity is talent scarcity. I mean, they have a lot of difficulty finding the people that they need at many different levels. And it's kind of weird because on the other hand, we know that most of the economies across Latin America have high unemployment rates. And therefore, I mean, how is it that you cannot find the people? And the issue is mostly around employability. I mean, we have which is also a demonstration of the poor educational systems that exist across the region. So it's I mean, there are a lot of people that they need jobs or they need better jobs, but on the other hand, they don't have the skills that are required by the different businesses across Latin America, and that's a huge challenge to improve productivity.
Right. We need to talk a little bit about Venezuela. Jill, I'd like to start with you. I know Roberta also has questions on this. Of course, it's on everybody's mind. The country is in deep crisis. Yes. Do you see any way out soon for Venezuela? Do you see some improvement happening in that country, Jill?
To be honest, I think soon would be very over-optimistic. People have been saying for years that it can't go on like this and something will happen, but it does go on. To be honest, I mean, announcing that Juan Guaidó was now going to be the interim president and everyone was going to back him, it created expectations that there would be rapid change, and that has kind of run into the sand. He hasn't gained that much traction, and to be honest, I think the fact that there have been a lot of threats emanating from Washington about the military option still being on the table, all of that really helps to strengthen what otherwise is a very badly damaged government. And it strengthens the Maduro government on the one hand because in the region there's really no support for any kind of US direct intervention anywhere in the region, but also because, as has been the case in other countries, including Mexico, Trump makes these threats and then doesn't act on them. So I think there's an increasing feeling within Venezuela that it's all empty talk.
Roberta.
I concur with Jill completely on her outlining of the situation. I think the U.S. administration and some around the region had believed that the recognition of Guaidó and the number of countries that did so and then perhaps the trigger or stimulus of the confrontation on the border over getting humanitarian assistance into Venezuela would trigger large-scale military defections and begin the end of the Maduro regime, and that has not been the case. And part of that is that members of the Maduro government and the military are going to protect up until the end the ill-gotten gains, if you will, the corruption that they have engaged in for years, and therefore are unlikely, without guarantees of non-prosecution or restitution, to change sides. I also think that as a region, the countries in Latin America and especially in South America need to be, and are, I think, more concerned with Venezuela than sometimes the U.S. bluster is. You may have as many as 5 million Venezuelans having left the country by the end of this year. That has become an almost existential question for Colombia, but it has also affected others in the region without a regional response and without the resources needed to tackle it. And you continue to have a leader in Maduro who seems completely impervious to the suffering of his own people, and therefore levying more and more sanctions, including oil sanctions on Venezuela, I think is unlikely to turn anything around.
Yeah, so this remains a difficult environment for global businesses to operate in. I mean, most businesses are either out of it, stay out of it, or if they're in, just keep quiet until things are sort of beginning to improve. But as Jill, as you said, it's probably a long haul before we're going to see an outcome here. Let's move on quickly. So much to talk about, but I do want to move to the second segment, which is really around more the issue of the perspective of the consumer, demand, and the issue of inequality. And I'd like to start with showing this slide that I hope is visible for the audience, which is, thank you, which is looking at consumer confidence as we just measured it for the first quarter of 2019. And here at the conference board on the left-hand side, you see the levels of consumer confidence. So the hotter regions, this is a heat map, so the hotter regions like Peru, for example, but also Mexico, Colombia, have pretty decent levels of consumer confidence, fairly optimistic consumers if it's above 100. Other parts of the region, notably, of course, Venezuela and Argentina, are way below that level of optimism. Even in Brazil, it's close to neutral, but slightly below. What's interesting on the right-hand side is the change. And there we're looking at the last quarter of 2018 to the first quarter of 2019. And there you see that with the exception of Brazil, which is basically stable and unchanged, all the other regions have seen an improvement in consumer confidence. And that's actually quite striking, also compared to other regions in the world. There is a fair level of optimism, and it has increased compared to where it was in late 2018. Now, before we dive a little bit more into a sentiment of the consumer and what this all means, let's go to the next poll question. This is a question that is based on what we're also asking consumers, but we would like to ask you this question too. And that is, what do you expect is Latin America's consumers' biggest concern over the next 6 months? So if you have to pick from this list, the biggest concern that you think Latin America's consumers are concerned with, please go. And of course, there are lots of answers here, so I'll give you a little bit more time. There may be multiple concerns, but just pick the one that you think is actually the biggest concern for Latin America's consumers. And then after that, I will go straight on with questions to our audience to gain a little bit on time, or to our panel, sorry, to gain a little bit on time. So give it a few more seconds, but there's a very clear kind of response coming through. So 5 more seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're closing it. Okay, so more than 2/3 of you as respondents are saying that political stability, frankly, is the biggest concern for consumers. More than 2/3. 20% think it's the economy that is a bigger concern. 8% believe that it is children's education and welfare, so it's the education system. And then 4% is pointing at increasing prices. But a very, very strong majority for the political stability. And indeed, in this slide, you're seeing the responses from consumers over time. This is a longer time perspective. The blue bar is looking at what Latin American consumers think about over the 2010 to 2015 period. And the orange bar is the 2016 to the beginning of 2019 period. And you do see a clear shift towards economic and political stability, exactly the way you answered the question for the last quarter. You see that shift in political stability where the orange bar becomes much more important, but then also the economy, which actually in people's responses is even the more important one. Let's go straight to discussing the results here with our panel. And Roberta, I'd like to start with you. Obviously, inequality has been a big theme in Mexico during the presidential campaign. But ultimately, you can talk about inequality forever. It is about access to the sources of wealth and growth. And that's education, that's healthcare, that's housing, that's security, because that is what makes people ultimately, more productive and help them improve their living standards. So what do you see come from all those political promises that have been made in the political campaign? What can we be seeing in something that will help consumers to become more confident about their future?
Well, I think overall what you've seen in terms of the response of the Mexican population is disappointment. Macroeconomic policy and domestic social and political policy, basically since 2000 in Mexico, has indeed been focused on fulfilling promises to reduce inequality and improve social mobility. And you have seen growth in the middle class, as you did elsewhere in the region. And yet the vast majority of Mexicans felt so strongly that promises had not been met that they voted 53% in a four-way race for López Obrador, who painted himself as a real outsider, despite being a career politician. I think what you see is a population that I would say largely is focused on the economy and on crime and security. I can't overstate the importance of the crime and security issue in terms of their feeling of confidence. We just had results of the first 3 months of this year as the most violent in Mexican history, and a protest against López Obrador in one state because of recent killings. And I think that they're going to really confront a lot of difficulty in how they tackle that issue in a way that brings results that people can see. The other area that people voted on very strongly was corruption and anti-corruption, true disgust with all of the political system for the corruption that they had seen. There has been a lot of talk about corruption by López Obrador and some action against fuel theft, for example, and the huachicoleros. The fact is that systemically, or in terms of prosecutions, there's been virtually nothing done in his first 4 months in office. And I think you are also going to begin to see an erosion of some of the confidence that people felt. He still has poll numbers that are remarkably high. They hovered between 70 and 85%, now trending a little bit downwards, but polls that most leaders would be delighted to have. But I'm not sure how long that can remain. And one of the reforms that was passed under President Peña Nieto that was absolutely crucial to Mexican productivity and its economic growth was education reform, which really gets at the issue of the quality of education, not just access, because access from K through 12 has been fairly positive over the last 20 years. It's the quality that has faltered. And López Obrador is committed to undoing or changing that educational reform, which is a very bad signal, I think, for moving forward. I also think that the continuing relationship with the United States, failure to ratify the USMCA for whatever reason, and tensions that are increasing on migration. You saw the President Trump just this morning tweet out a very anti-Mexico message on Mexican soldiers and an incident that occurred at the border. But increasing tensions on that, even though López Obrador does not want to engage, is also going to be something that I think Mexicans begin to be very concerned about in a somewhat contradictory way. They will want that relationship to be strong and improving, but they will also, I think, continue to feel, as they did under President Peña Nieto, that Mexico needs to stand up for its own beliefs and against the vilification of Mexicans, as we've seen by the administration. So I do think there's a very real possibility for for disillusionment again. But right now he has both congressional pluralities and popularity to implement his vision if we knew really what that was beyond some very specific areas that I think so far he's failed to convince the public that he's truly implementing.
Yeah, and I want to underline your comment that you just made about it's not just about access to education, but quality of education. And I think that's of critical importance because, we can talk about these numbers that just show that, everybody goes to school, but what kind of schooling? I think it's true for all the regions for all the countries in the region. Leah, let me ask you the same question on sort of, consumer sentiment and what I feel is important. The presidential campaign last year in Brazil was very much run on security and safety, and that is something that's important on people's minds in Brazil. The president promised a lot, but what do we see come true? And as I showed you the numbers, it seems that Brazilian consumers are still a little bit on the fence when it comes to their confidence in going forward.
Yes, and we have the two main points of the new government was the issue of the economic agenda in terms of liberalization. So he has the support of the market, and the other agenda is related to corruption and safety, about the issue of the big increase in criminality in Brazil. The Minister of Justice has sent to the Congress the new law on anti-crime, as they say. And the problem is very much based in terms of increasing the possibility of prison for people, and also to make possible to people to have more arms. We have in our Congress what we call a bullet party, okay, that defend the idea that people, because in Brazil it's forbidden to have their own arms. So this is happening, okay? The problem is a very complicated issue, this in Brazil, and so they send this kind of proposal to the Congress, and the Congress hasn't yet voted it. So it's a bit of concern for some people. It's a lot of concern if this is the best way really to tackle the problem of criminality in Brazil. In terms of quality education, I think that is very important, that people is really worried in Brazil. We also are not having good news, because we have a really problem in Brazil about quality of education. And the new Minister of Education as well is not someone that is linked to the sector of education. So unfortunately, in this area, we are not going very well. So in terms of criminality, if you believe this is the way to solve the problem, to give people more arms, that will happen. But I don't think this is the way. And in terms of the other things, like health, education, the government hasn't really announced anything. They are always saying that we have to cut expenditures. So they have cut a lot of expenditures on the research, on technology, that's very worried the students, especially people that are doing their graduate students. And so I don't think it's a very good scenario, okay, in these terms. And in terms of consumer, the really big issue for them is the crime, and also job. But Brazil has a very huge unemployment rate, around 12%, and it's very difficult to imagine that if we grow this year 1.7%, 1.5%, that you have a huge change in this kind of statistics, okay? We have already did our labor reform, and so we have to wait a little. So it's not a very confident scenario. Although yesterday here at Fundação, we released the business confidence, and it has give a little up. So the businessmen are more confident. I think they have linked to the idea that the fiscal reform, the security reform, will go through the Congress. But in the other issues, as in terms of inequality and all those things, People are not
Well, and I think
very
that's an important result, the rise in business confidence, because that is the beginning of a willingness and an ability of businesses to invest in the economy. Brazil has a huge backlog when it comes to investment, both public and private. So I think there's a little bit of hope there, but as you explained very well, consumers are on the fence to see it all really happen after all they have gone through in the last couple of years. Jill, I want to transition to you. We already talked extensively about education, and I want to show this slide from Oxford Analytica, which I think is a great slide. You did a study where you basically looked at how much wastage, and I think all of you on the panel already today talked a lot about this, how much wastage there is happening in the economy. And the point that you're trying to make in this slide, that in many cases, we lost more money because of wastage and inefficiency than the total expenditure on education that is needed in order to improve the education system. Maybe you can take us through quickly to sort of get a handle on that interesting comparison.
Sure. No, this is based on a report by the Inter-American Development Bank, but what they conclude is that public spending across the region accounts for nearly 30% of GDP, which varies from about 50% in Argentina to under 20% in Guatemala. But in a lot of countries, the wastage is extremely high. It comes to a total that they estimate $220 billion annually, which would be enough to eliminate poverty. And if you look at this slide, the largest amount of wastage, again, is Argentina. It's over 7% of GDP, which is more than their education budget. And that is true in 6 countries out of the region. And education and training is also being squeezed by pension demands. As Leah was talking about the pension reform in Brazil, this is a very key issue in much of the region, but pension spending as a percentage of GDP is quite a lot higher in most countries than education spending. So younger people are being crowded out in terms of training. And this is something which has an effect on sustaining inequality. And at the same time, as you have more poverty and more inequality, there's more demand for what we might see as wasteful spending which is on short-term subsidies or bloated public sector payrolls rather than capital spending or education spending. So it's very badly targeted, and this is entrenching the problems we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a very powerful slide, and it also shows there are some good cases. I mean, there are cases like, for example, Chile or Costa Rica, where we actually do see that these numbers can go down. So it's not impossible to do it. It just needs a longer-term commitment of governments to make this happen.
No, that's right. Chile's got the lowest level of wastage in the region. Chile and Peru have got the lowest levels of wastage in the region, so it is doable.
Martin, I think this is a great transition to talk a little bit about policy, but also strategy implications. We talked so much about education already, and obviously at Mercer, you're right on top of this. So let's move right away to what are the implications of all this? What are you seeing on the ground in terms of what companies are trying to do to work with governments to improve public, but also private education and strengthen training? I mean, those seem to me sort of, a critical factor in order to make the economies more innovative, in order to make the companies more productive, to make them more serve the demands of their people. So talk us a little bit through what are the most important initiatives and where do you see some success cases in Latin America in that respect?
I mean, I will share 2 stories. At the corporate level, which is my area of expertise. I mean, companies, as I said, are very concerned with talent scarcity, and then therefore they are trying to do what they can to increase employability. So we did some research a couple of years ago, and we identified some cases. One of those was a retailer, which is well known, which is Walmart in Brazil. They employ thousands of employees, and they also have huge turnover, and they were having a hard time finding the people with some very basic skills for doing the work that need to be conducted at the stores. And they created a retail school, so where they finance an education program where they incorporated 1,000 of people every year. They funded this program, and those that are graduating from there, they don't have a commitment to work for Walmart. However, many of them, they ended up working for Walmart, And in addition, they had influence on the curriculum for the program, and that was extremely helpful because they were able to include some skills that then they were required to work in the store. So that's one example. The other one, it's a technology endeavor in Argentina. There is an institution called the Digital House. As you may know, there are a few highly successful technology companies based in Argentina, like Mercado Libre and Despegar, and they are facing a huge challenge meeting the talent demands on technology people. So therefore, they got together several technology companies, and they built up this digital house, which is a coding school in essence. So again, those who are attending the programs, they don't need to work for these companies when they graduated, but they have access. They are increasing the number of people who are qualified to work with them, and therefore they are also more successful attracting them when they finish the different certification courses that they offer. So these are only a few examples of companies being active on improving the education for the population, and who are also having an impact on the economy.
So one of the key issues here, of course, is that, and we didn't talk much about that, but I think it is important. I mean, most Latin Americans are characterized by this very large informal part of their economy. And obviously pooling that part of the economy into the formal part of the economy is important. I mean, that is a major sort of demographic opportunity that the region has. What do you see in terms of initiatives to make sure that these smaller businesses that rely very heavily on informal labor can also see this improvement in education so that people become more effective and can build their own living and invest in their own lives and so on?
What we see is more and more businesses impacted by the influence on technology and the deployment of the digital economy. So it's more and more difficult to operate if you are part of the informal economy, considering all the flows of information that are going back and forward. So therefore, I see activities that in the past were informal that have moved into the formal economy because of this revolution led by technology. And this is affecting many different parts of the economy.
Roberto, any comments on the informality of the economy? Any things that you have been seeing when you were in Mexico, where you have seen activities to begin to reduce the size of the sector and pull these people into the formal sector of the economy?
There was a really strong effort made under the previous government to move people into the formal sectors, all kinds of incentives for doing so in terms of the tax base, in terms of digital filing of things and trying to make it easier for people, and reducing the mountains of paperwork and sort of notarials and et cetera that were needed to establish your business. And it had some success in the early years of the Peña Nieto government. I've seen virtually nothing as a follow-up to that, nor anything that's more broadly targeted to the informal sector, enabling them to enter into the formal sector. And it's pretty clear that would be a huge boost for Mexico in all kinds of revenues, as well as in the protections given to those who work in the informal sector, whether that's health or social security, et cetera. And very little discussion about the ways of doing that, even though I think, as the other experts have pointed out, we do know what some of the tools are to bring people into the formal sector. It just simply hasn't been a priority since a number of years ago when it was attempted.
We have a few more minutes left, but I want to make sure that we can spend a little bit of time on issues around foreign trade and the building of this global value chains. I mean, there's been a lot of change in the way that countries do business with each other. The traditional, export-import kind of model has changed into, countries becoming part of value chains in all sorts of areas. How successful is, take an example like Brazil, how successful is Brazil in sort of modernizing the way that it is looking at trade and its involvement in globalization? Or is it still all about, trade in natural resources, and selling mining products and so on? Do we see a change? Because this is one of the changes that might make a real difference for engaging Latin American countries in these global value chains and make them more sustainable for growth in the longer term.
Yes, I agree. The thing that our main export today are really commodities is linked to the enormous growth of China during the first decade of this century. But we have a lot of discussion here in Brazil on how to make our export more, have more value added. And I think one of the main obstacles in the case of Brazil is productivity, because we export what we produce, and our productivity is very low, and also the issue of infrastructure. Okay? This is the point. I think this government is taking some steps that are important. They are trying to announce, they are studying and announcing some new rules in order to facilitate the investment in infrastructure from the private sector. Because as the government really doesn't have the money, we really have to rely on private financing to make our infrastructure. That is one of our main bottlenecks in the case of Brazil. So it's very important for us that the investment come for this kind of sector. We have a very close relation with the Chinese in this sense. We have a Brazil-China fund, but I don't think that all our problems are always solved only by the Chinese. There's a need really for other countries and other investors to take confidence in terms of the new rules in the case of infrastructure. It's not a very easy task, but one of the problems of Brazil is really the change of the rules, the environment that sometimes is not very friendly to the business. That's very known in the case of Brazil. So if you want this investment, and it's important also for trade integration, because we have trade, we have trade agreements, free trade agreements with all the countries in South America, but the problem is again infrastructure. We cannot have trade, a lot of trade with the country, if you don't have good railroads, if you don't have good logistics, and this is a problem in the case of Brazil. If you want really to improve our export.
Excellent comment. Thank you so much. We have two final questions, Jill, which I'm going to put to you, and then we have to wrap up, so we have to do it quickly. But one question was on the slide that we showed earlier, how wastage in that slide was defined, maybe how it was measured. Maybe you can say something briefly about that. And then finally, was a more content-related question. In Argentina, do you see an increase in the threat of unionization of professional employees? So that was one specific question. If you can take those two quickly, and then we will wrap up.
Sure. Well, by inefficiency, what we're talking about is various things. Part of it is what's described as leakage in procurement, which is both corruption, but also budget overruns, time overruns, and also overblown public sector payrolls and transfers such as energy subsidies, other kinds of subsidies that are not actually very productive. It's not all purely corruption, but it's it's poor spending, it's poorly managed spending. A lot of times you have very large public sector payrolls made up primarily of people who are not very qualified and can't actually implement program. They're just there for political reasons. And which also obviously I fear makes it quite difficult to reduce that as well. And in terms of Argentina, we are very much sort of pending, waiting to see what happens with the elections now in October. As I say, I think politics is just so key in terms of business strategy, economic outlook, productivity outlook. And it's a completely unpredictable picture at the moment. You've got the incumbent and his predecessor who are both hugely unpopular, but one of them will win. And either if Cristina Kirchner is re-elected, you will see a reversal of policy. If Macri should be re-elected, he is already in the process of reversing policies because he hasn't been able to implement them successfully. So at the moment, we can't see anything except both foreign and domestic investors kind of frozen like rabbits in the headlights, waiting to see what's happening. Wait and see.
That's the message here. Well, you can see that I could spend another hour with this panel, and I probably will at some point in time, but we have to wrap up now. And I'd like to thank all our 4 panel members for their great contributions. It was a great discussion, a lot of content here. and I hope that our members have benefited from it. So thank you all for joining us. This was this month's window on. Next month, we have on 22 May a window on where we're actually only using our internal experts. We'll talk about a topic very important for the Conference Board, that's America's competitiveness in the global economy. It's a very different topic. It will be actually moderated by our President and CEO, Steve Odland. And then finally, of course, there are publications and resources you can download, including some that we refer to here in this webcast. Thank you again for joining. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form. Thanks to the panel, and I wish you all a very good day ahead of us.